And good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's having a good April 9th. My name is Evan Weiner, and hopefully we're a step closer for me to actually come in and do this in front of you. I'm going to be doing a live one at the Atria in Rybrook in April 28th. So we're going to try to see if we could do that on the Atria there. But today we'll talk a little bit about the Cold War and the space race. And when I was a kid back in the 1960s, I used to think that this was really, really cool, the space race. And I thought it was about space. Little did I realize that it was part of a Cold War, which it was. I'm just letting a couple more people in here. Okay, we got a couple more people in. So anyway, the space race, part of the Cold War. The Cold War, which started in 1945 after World War II, and in a sense is continuing today, even though the Soviet Union is long gone. On July 20th, 1969, man did land on the moon and fulfilled John Kennedy's promise that America would put man on the moon, or men on the moon, by the end of the 1960s. And there is Neil Armstrong on the moon. JFK makes, this is a speech he gives at Rice University, but on May 25th, 1961, John Kennedy said, Americans will be on the moon because we choose to go to the moon and these other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard, because that goal will serve to organize the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Funny thing about John Kennedy was he wanted to get to the moon, but he had no interest in the space program per se. Didn't care about what happened day to day. He just wanted to see the first boots that, or first boot marks on the moon were done by an American. The Cold War competition. Kennedy, I'm not that interested in space, he told a NASA administrator in a private meeting, when he made clear that space priorities other than a lunar landing meant little to him, as did arriving on the moon second. You better just be there first. And there's the guy who really put the lunar program into orbit, so to speak. That is Lyndon Johnson, and he's meeting with NASA's James Webb. Johnson was a proponent of the space program and really wanted to see man on the moon. And there is a theory that had Kennedy not been assassinated in 1963, that he would not have pushed Congress in 1964 to get the funding needed to go to the moon. It would just have been a promise, and a promise not kept. He was more interested in re-election. The CBS News anchor, Old Iron Pants himself, that was his nickname. I dealt with Walter twice in my life. One was totally about playing hockey. He played hockey in Houston, Texas as a teenager in the 1930s as a teen, and he said he enjoyed it. Anyway, Cronkite referred to the former President Lyndon Johnson as the father of the program. No one did more than LBJ to commit the U.S. to landing men on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. And there is Lyndon Johnson. That's July 16th, 1969. He is watching the Apollo 11 blast off from Cape Canaveral in Florida, heading to the moon. And of course, he is a VIP there, the former president of the United States at this point. And Apollo 11. And as you can see through the window, or rather the face shield, a picture of what's going on, not only with the astronauts standing there, but the lunar module and the other man on the moon and his shadow, all encapsulated in that picture. Neil Armstrong was the first man to land on the moon. Neil Armstrong didn't even know if he was going to survive this. In June of 1969, Armstrong was talked about, or actually afterwards, but he talked about June of 1969. He said, a month before the launch of Apollo 11, we decided we were confident enough we could try and attempt a descent to the surface. I thought we had a 90% chance of getting back safely to Earth. 10% chance he was going to be killed on that flight, but only a 50-50 chance of making a landing on the first attempt. There were so many unknowns on that descent from lunar orbit down to the surface that had not been demonstrated yet by testing, and there was a big chance that there was something in there we didn't understand properly, and we had to abort and come back to Earth without landing. And there is the Apollo 11 crew. There's Neil Armstrong, arm up, waving, Michael Collins behind him, and Buzz Aldrin, one of the two astronauts that I ever dealt with, him and Thomas Stafford, the commander of the Apollo 10 mission back in May 1969. Armstrong continued. When Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made their descent aboard the Eagle to the moon's surface, the onboard computer, which was far less powerful than this thing is thousands of times, my little cell phone, thousands of times more powerful than what was on board the moon or the craft that took them to the moon. The onboard computer had intended them to put them down on the side of a large crater with steep slopes littered with huge boulders. Armstrong said, "That's not a good place to land," and he took over flying the lunar module by himself. I took it over manually, flew it like a helicopter out to the west direction, took it to a smoother area without so many rocks, and found a level area, and was able to get it down before we ran out of fuel. It was something like 20 seconds of fuel left. I don't know if you remember this, but I did watch this back in 1969. It was on a Sunday, July 20th, 1969. And I do remember the guy talking to Armstrong. I think it was Charlie Duke, who was talking down in Houston, and they're communicating back and forth. And Duke says something, "You got a bunch of guys about ready to turn blue here," which means they were afraid what was going on up there. That's one of the first pictures from the moon. It's a bag of garbage, litter. These guys litter. The first thing they did was open the hatch and throw out garbage. For all I know, that litter is still on the moon, and the lunar police still have not issued tickets to Neil Armstrong or to Buzz Aldrin. It was a short stay, 2.5-hour moonwalk. The astronauts came back on board the module, 47 pounds of rock, before taking off. If you ever went to the Smithsonian Institute, there is one of the rocks there that you walk in and you could touch it and feel it and all that other stuff. Michael Collins remained in the command module. He was going around the moon, and if need be, at a moment's instance, he had 18 rescue procedures at hand should something have failed on the surface below. And there's Buzz Aldrin, the #2 guy on the moon. But had things been a little different, and possibly had NASA followed what they normally did in terms of space shots, Buzz Aldrin would have been the first guy on the moon, but he was second. I'll let Buzz explain to you, and NASA explains to you what happened. On the NASA history website, Apollo Expeditions to the Moon tells a little different story of a little different version of the story that what really happened. NASA originally thought that Aldrin would be the first man to step on the moon, but the lunar module, which was built by Grumman out in Bethpage, Long Island, Bethpage, New York. In fact, I speak at the Bethpage Library, and one of the things that you see in the Bethpage Library, right in the middle of it, is this mock-up of the lunar module that Grumman gave them after Grumman pulled out of town. So it's right there in plexiglass, so you could see what the lunar module looked like as far as a mock-up at the Grumman factory. Anyway, the lunar module posed the logistical challenges that made this order impossible. It was built not with thinking that Aldrin would be the first guy out. The hatch seat opened on the opposite side of where Aldrin was sitting. For Aldrin to get out first, it would have been necessary for one bulky suited backpack astronaut to climb over another one, according to NASA. When that moment was tried, and they did try it in rehearsals, the backpack was damaged, as was the lunar module. So that was out. There is Armstrong's long shadow looking at the lunar module there. Aldrin said in all previous missions, because he's trying to get to be the first guy on the moon, and he's coming up with an excuse why he should be. In all previous missions, if someone, a crew member, was to spacewalk, it was always the junior person, which he was, not the space commander, which Neil Armstrong was, who would stay inside. I felt there was an obligation on my part to put forth the reasons why a commander who had been burdened down with an enormous amount of responsibility and training for activities should stay inside. He didn't convince NASA. Armstrong was number one. And Armstrong and Aldrin were picked out by this guy, Donald Deke Slayton, who was the head of the astronauts. He never got up into space because he had an ailment. He was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. So here's the rotation. And the fact that Armstrong and Aldrin were the first two on the moon didn't really matter to NASA. They just were going ahead with a plan. Apollo 7, Wally Schirra, Isley and Cunningham would be the guys going up in Apollo 7 with Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan as the backups. Apollo 8 would be Borman, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. Apollo 8's backup was Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin flying the craft, not being the guy who was going in the lunar module, that would be Fred Hayes as the backup. Apollo 9, McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikert. The backup, Conrad, Gordon, and Bean. And Apollo 10 would be Stafford, Young, and Cernan. And if all went according to plan, the backup crew for the Apollo 8 would be the guys going on Apollo 11, landing on the moon. And there you see Aldrin, there you see Michael Collins, and there you see Neil Armstrong on the left. Collins is still alive. The success of Apollo 8 in December 1968 meant it was time to name a crew for Apollo 11. Deke Slayton had full confidence in the existing crews as part of the rotation, both Armstrong's and Conrad's, and he figured, you know what, just keep it. And there's no guarantee that Apollo 11 would be the first landing, so just stay with the original rotation, but make a quick change. Michael Collins came back to Armstrong's group. Aldrin was slid sideways. Collins was back to work after surgery, and he thought that Collins deserved a spot on the first mission available, which was that one. He was named the command module pilot. Armstrong's crew, while Aldrin was demoted, but was that a real demotion?
Make sure you fill it out,
okay. Number 2 guy to the number 3 guy. Number 2 guy meant that he was going to, 3 guy meant he was going to walk on the moon. And he trained for that role anyway on Apollo 8 and Apollo 9, so it made sense. The crew is not certain. They were going to be the first on the moon. NASA had a tight sequence of missions happening every few months, and all mission objectives needed to be accomplished for each one to get to Apollo 11 and Apollo 11 getting to the moon in time. And there is the logo for the Apollo 11 mission. Armstrong took over the landing himself when he saw the computer was guiding them to a boulder fold landing zone. Landing was achieved at 4:14 p.m. Eastern Time, only 25 seconds of fuel left. Armstrong announced, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. But there was some drama also going on, which you might have forgotten about or didn't know about, because the Soviets, well, they were going to try to steal some of the thunder of Apollo 11 by landing an unmanned craft on the moon and then bringing back moon rocks to Earth to the Soviet Union. And this might have caused a bit of a problem because NASA didn't know whether you could have their craft and their lunar module, 2 separate transmissions, sending waves back to the Earth along with a Russian or Soviet craft. The Lunar 15 mission would orbit the moon at the same time as Apollo 11. Both would be sending radio signals to Earth. But Frank Borman, one of the NASA astronauts, knew some of the cosmonauts in the Soviet Union. He was friendly with them, and he wanted to get some information that actually both countries probably needed on what the Lunar 15 flight plan was. His info from his friends, the Soviet friends, confirmed that transmission wouldn't be a problem. Lunar 15 began circling the moon July 17, 1969. If all went according to plan, the Soviet craft could be back on Earth with a container of lunar soil the day after the Apollo 11 astronauts would return, close enough to kind of upstage the US achievement slightly. Or if Apollo 11 totally failed, that would have given the Soviets an outright triumph. The Soviets had the first spacecraft, the Sputnik, back in 1957. First man in space, Yuri Gagarin. First woman in space. First probe of Venus, and other firsts. And John Kennedy ran for president in 1960 on the platform of a missile gap. And now he's president, and there's a gap, space race gap, that he wants to close almost immediately. But on July 21st, as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were preparing to leave the Sea of Tranquility, Lunar 15 was making its descent into the Sea of Creases, smashed into a mountain, and that was the end of the Soviet, that was the end of the Soviet mission. Dreaming of the moon. H.G. Wells dreamt of space, War of the Worlds between the Martians and Earthlings. In this book, H.G. Wells, The First Men in the Moon, a novel. Robert Goddard is the father of modern rocketry. 1926 here shown with his rocket. Dr. Robert Hutchins Goddard is considered the father of modern rocket propulsion. Goddard had constructed and successfully tested his rocket using liquid fuel on March 16, 1926 in Auburn, Massachusetts. Goddard was somewhat known, not necessarily known for good things, but he was somewhat known. Goddard first obtained public notice in 1907 when he was at the Worcester Polytechnical Institute playing around with explosives, apparently. And there was a cloud of smoke from a powder rocket that filled the basement of the building. He would come back to that idea a little later on. In 1914, he received 2 U.S. patents. One was for a rocket using fuel. The other was for a 2 or 3 stage rocket using fuel. That would bring man to the moon in 1969, that idea. And there's Goddard with one of his missile, well, it's not missile. Yeah, I guess you could call it a missile, one of his projects, a booster. Towards the end of 1920, a report, Goddard outlined the possibility of a rocket reaching the moon, and he never forgot what happened in the basement in Worcester, exploding a large load of flash powder there to mark its arrival, just so we could here on Earth see this whole thing go up. It's kind of impractical, but he was thinking of that. But he did explain that a rocket could reach the moon. His rocket flight in 1929 carried the first scientific payroll, a barometer, and a camera. There is a dark side to the space program, a really, really dark side that somehow was kind of covered up in the 1960s. See, that's the V-2 rocket. In the V-2 rocket, one of the designers of the V-2 rocket was the Nazi scientist Wernher von Braun, who was shipped off to America following the fall of Germany, or surrendered, knowing that the Germans were going to fall. And he ends up in the United States rocket program. It was called Operation Paperclip. Goddard's work largely anticipated in technical detail the German V-2 missiles, including gyroscopic control, steering by means of vanes in the jet stream of the rocket motor, gimbal steering, power-driven fuel pumps, and other devices. And there is the V-2 rocket, which von Braun helped develop. In fact, the German scientists, the Nazi scientists, reached out to Goddard eventually to ask him what he thought. Launched from mobile units, each V-2 rocket was 46 feet high, carried a ton of explosives. First attack on London, September 8, 1944, gouged a crater 32 feet across. Some of that stuff is still in London. You could go there and you could see craters and things from the V-2 rocket to this day. Killed 3 people, injuring 22. And that's the devastation that the rocket heaped upon London back in 1944. It took just 5 minutes from launch to landing. V stood for Vergeltungswaffen, or retaliatory weapon. It was a last-ditch attempt by the Germans to reverse the course of the war. The Germans by 1944 were losing. Who made these rockets for von Braun and others? Well, I wouldn't call them prisoners. That's what people call them, prisoners. They were concentration camp victims. And many of them were pulled out of concentration camps because in their previous lives, they had technical skills such as welding. They worked around the clock in an underground factory called Mittelwalk near Buchenwald concentration camp in central Germany. They lived under rather appalling conditions, no daylight, little sleep, or proper sanitation. But the concentration camp victims who were forced to do this, the slave labor, decided that we think we could sabotage this. And they figured out ways of sabotaging things like urinating on pieces that they had just installed in these missiles. Many were executed for attempted sabotage. Eyewitness accounts describe prisoners as being hanged from cranes above the rocket assembly lines as if to warn the people, hey, don't you do this, you're next. But they were living in such bad conditions. What did they have to lose? Second from the right is Wernher von Braun. That is Wernher von Braun, who would be the father of the American space program, shown here with various Nazi officials. It's very, very complicated, or von Braun made it complicated, explaining his background. He said he joined the Nazi Party on November 12, 1937, but claimed he was coerced by the SS. It's been documented that von Braun did not want his research used for military purposes, and he claimed he had to work with the Nazi Party. He also came from a politically connected family. And there he is in that back row there again. Von Braun with some of some big-time Nazis in that picture. The engineer who designed the V-2 was von Braun. The Allies realized that the V-2 was a machine unlike that they've ever seen before, and the Allies never developed it either. But it didn't work. After the war ended, the Americans, Soviets, and British scrambled to get their hands on V-2 technology. Von Braun would make a key decision here. He's going to surrender to the Americans and hope for the best. The Russians, meanwhile, got their hands on the V-2 factory and the test range. And here is von Braun pictured with some of the Mercury 7 astronauts. He is on the right side, second in. Operation Paperclip brought him over to the United States. Operation Paperclip, Truman administration was an opportunity for the United States to utilize the mind power of some of the most brilliant minds that worked in Nazi Germany during World War II. More than 1,600 Nazi German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from Germany to America, and that included von Braun. The Cold War starts after World War II is over, and it pitted the democratic capitalistic United States against the communist Soviet Union. At least that's what the two countries said about each other. Beginning in the late 1950s, space would become another arena for this competition. Each side wanted to prove its superiority of technology, its military firepower, and by extension, its political economic system. Sputnik goes up in 1957 for the Soviets. For 15 years after World War II, von Braun worked with the Army. He didn't want his work to go to the military, right? Well, it goes to military, both in Germany and in the United States. He worked with the U.S. Army in the development of ballistic missiles. As part of a military operation, he and an initial group of 125 who were in America were sent to Fort Bliss, Texas. They worked on rockets for the U.S. Army, assisted American V-2 launches at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. In 1950, the team moves to the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama, and they designed a bunch of missiles, including the Army's Redstone and Jupiter ballistic missiles, as well as the Jupiter-C, Juno-2, Saturn-1 launch vehicles. It would be a Jupiter-C that orbited the Earth in 1958, which was the first U.S. successful satellite, the Explorer 1. There is von Braun and Walt Disney. And you may say, what is von Braun doing with Walt Disney? Well, there's a good thing, a good reason that he's with Walt Disney, because Walt Disney has a TV show on ABC. Walt Disney ended up, I'm sorry about that phone. Walt Disney ended up on ABC because ABC and Walt Disney cut a deal that allowed Disney to build Disneyland with Paramount ABC money. And Disneyland had some shows. That was what it was called in the mid-1950s. And 3 of the shows featured one of von Braun. Now, the Disney shows were aimed at kids. And why not get kids all excited about the space program? Hey, kids were excited about Captain Video. If they had real live space vehicles, they may get even more excited. So Walt Disney has von Braun on 3 times on shows all about man in space. And von Braun is trying to push, and he's an advocate for space exploration in the United States in the 1950s. He wrote numerous books. He wrote several articles for magazines such as Collier's, which obviously is not in business anymore. And he was the spokesman. He was the spokesman for 3 Walt Disney TV programs on space travel. Man in Space. But all of that stuff, all the positive things going on in the United States were eclipsed by the launch of this, Sputnik. And by the way, the Defense Department of the United States wasn't too upset with the Russians or the Soviets getting into space first, because the Americans would have to play catch up, which meant that more money would go into the state, rather the department, rather the Defense Department, after the Sputnik launch. Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. A Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, Russian word for traveler, first artificial satellite, first man-made object to be placed in the Earth's orbit. And when I was doing this talk live, there was one guy who's, I went around the room, and I can't do it with Zoom. If I could, I would, but I really can't. But I went around the room, and I asked people of a certain age who remembered Sputnik, were you afraid that the Soviets had a spacecraft up? And most of them said, no, not really. But there was one guy who said, yeah, he was afraid, not because of the Sputnik, but the intercontinental ballistic missile that launched it could reach New York. And that's what he was concerned about, not about Sputnik, which he thought, okay, they got something in space. Sputnik was basically the size of a beach ball, weighed 180 pounds in aluminum. It had 4 legs. It was stuffed with wires. It careened through space for about 3 months, circling the Earth every 100 minutes, emitting a regular pattern of beeps, which were used in rock and roll songs in the late 1950s. Beep, 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 beep. You know the songs I'm talking about from those days. There were a whole bunch of them, including the Flying Purple Eaters and all of those songs that had the beep that was going throughout the song. The launch of Sputnik kicked off a new phase of the Cold War, the space race. Eventually, the United States would recover from the Soviets' early lead. The first American satellite that was successful was launched from Cape Kennedy in Florida in 1958. It's Bill Cleary. Bill Cleary was on the United States Olympic hockey team back in 1956 and a member of the gold medal winning United States hockey team, a team that beat the Czechoslovakians in 1960. And he was telling me about Dwight Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev, the president of the United States, Eisenhower, and the premier of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, were trying to poke holes into the Cold War, and they were trying to figure out, well, what can we do? We can't carry on like this. Can't spend all this money on weapons and things of that nature. Maybe we can find a couple of things between our peoples that would help us reach some sort of détente. So Eisenhower and Khrushchev decide on a cultural exchange. The United States would send a hockey team, the American hockey team, the amateurs, and also a track and field team, while the Soviets would send to the United States the Moscow Circus. I used to love watching Ed Sullivan with the Moscow Dancing Bears. Yeah, that was cool. And the Bolshoi Ballet. Well, Cleary talked about his experience going to the Soviet Union, the experience he shared with his teammates. And he says they got together in Boston. Most of them were college students. Some of them were firemen and a few other things. Most of them were from the Boston area. So they get together in Boston, fly over to Moscow, and they're picked up. Whatever picked them up, a bus took them to from the airport to the hotel. And it was a grand hotel. It wasn't one of these 1950s neoclassic Soviet design with gray paint. It was a nice hotel, he said. And they get there, and they have roommates, two to a room, and they're checking the room to see if there are listening devices or whatever else might be planted in the room. And then it's time to go to dinner. And so it's going to be a big state dinner. They're honoring these hockey players. So the hockey players come down into the main room. They go to the table, and everything's decked out: the knives, the forks, the spoons, the plate, soup plate, napkins. And then underneath the napkin and the soup plate, they see a little miniature Sputnik. And I said to Cleary, well, what that was all about. He said, clearly intimidation. We're first in space. We're number one. That was the 1958 hockey tour of the Soviet Union. The Soviets, they had things in space. The United States, they had trouble launching satellites. Unfortunately, Latka the dog was picked to be destroyed. The Soviets decided in 1958 to put Latka the dog in space. They had 36 dogs. They picked Latka. Although the USSR long insisted that Latka had expired painlessly after about a week in orbit, that wasn't the case. The dog was sent up there and literally died within a few hours of takeoff. The Moscow Institute for Biological Problems leaked the true story of Latka the dog. She died within hours of the takeoff from panic and overheating. Sputnik 2, which is what she was on, continued to orbit the Earth for 5 months, then burned up when it re-entered the atmosphere in April 1958. The Soviets justified that they were going to kill this dog for the benefit of mankind in science. And here's the Americans, the Vanguard, a failure, blows up on the pad. The first how the Americans reacted was the Vanguard program. That was a joint National Academy of Sciences, U.S. Naval Research Laboratory project. And on December 6th, 1957, the Vanguard TV-3 blew up. By that time, the Soviets had some success. Well, it's hard to say they had success with Sputnik 2 because the dog was killed right after launch. The Explorer 1 did go up January 31st, 1958, first American success. And that was designed by the U.S. Army under the direction of Wernher von Braun. The same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signs a public order creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a federal agency dedicated solely to space education. This guy, Yuri Gagarin, would be the first man in space in 1961, so there's another first for the Soviets. In 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Lunar 2, the first space probe to hit the moon, and that was designed to hit the moon. April 61, Gagarin becomes the first to orbit the Earth in Vostok 1. The Mercury 7 astronauts were named in 1959. Wally Schirra to the left, and next to him is Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom, the small guy, in between Shepard and the boat-tied Donald Deke Slayton. John Glenn to Slayton's left, Scott Carpenter to John Glenn's left, and Gordon Cooper. He's the one who is holding the Mercury spacecraft. Now the question arises, how do you go about advertising for astronauts? What do you look for? Daredevils? Thrill seekers? What exactly do you look for? Do you put ads in the paper in the help wanted section saying, wanted a daredevil, possibly death-defying mission ahead? These guys are introduced on April 9th, 1959. They were the 7 that made the cut. And they made the cover of Life magazine. The astronauts, the start of continuing exclusive stories on the Apollo mission. Their wives made the cover of Life magazine. But how do you go about selecting those guys were selected? But what was the right criteria? I mean, who knows about space travel? Who'd make the best astronauts? High-risk professionals? Yeah, they might. But it's found eventually that let's just go into the nation's active military pilot. What we have are depth in the pilots, and let's see what we get out of there. And those were the 7 that were taken. So is Ham the chimp. He is the first live animal to go into space for the United States. Beginning in 1959, a 2-year-old chimpanzee by the name of Ham, trained to do simple time tasks in response to electric lights and sounds. During his pre-flight training, Ham was taught to push a lever within 5 seconds of seeing a flashing blue light. But it came with a price if he failed. Failure to do so resulted in an application of a mild electric shock to the soles of his feet. But you know what? Ham, when you're right, you got yourself a banana pellet. Ham was not a passenger. He was just not a passenger. He was the pilot, sort of. And if he did well, that means Alan Shepard could make the first suborbital flight on May 5th, 1961, aboard Freedom 7. And look at him. He is so, look at him. He is so happy. And he's there, and he goes up into a suborbital flight. Spaceship lives, paves the way for flight by man. He's like Harry Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune. Dewey defeats Truman. Ham looks like he's having a good old time, at least with that newspaper. Red line final. There's Eisenhower, President of the United States, giving Wernher von Braun yet another accolade. Eisenhower transferred his rocket development center to the Redstone Arsenal from the Army to NASA. The primary object was develop the giant Saturn rockets. And here's John F. Kennedy with Wernher von Braun again. It's over there. Yeah, that's the moon, Mr. President. We're going to the moon. You sure that's where it is, Wernher? Yes, I am. We're going to the moon, and you're going to help fund it. Okay, Wernher, I understand that. There's Kennedy and von Braun and the mock-up of the rocket that would take man to the moon. Von Braun became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Senate. Marshall's Flight, let's try it again, Marshall Space Flight Center down near Huntsville, and the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, the Super Booster, that would propel Americans to the moon. That is the Redstone rocket taking Alan Shepard into space. He didn't really go into space. He went into suborbital space, which meant he went up and down all within 15 minutes. There's Shepard, who had to go to the bathroom and kept asking, can I get out of here to go to the bathroom? No, you're going to stay in there. There were a lot of delays. Eventually, Shepard did get up into the suborbital atmosphere flight. At Marshall, the group continued to work on the Redstone Mercury rocket ship, which launched Alan Shepard, and it was all on the back of the lowest bidders because it was a government project, and government project relies on the lowest bidders, which Alan Shepard did talk about while he was sitting there waiting to blast off on May 5th, 1961. It was a success. He's rescued, and America's in space. They got a man sort of in space, not quite. Now, that is Katherine Johnson. And my friend Dick Holt worked for NASA between 1960, 1974, 1975. And Dick told me, we were talking one day, and some of the information that I'm giving here comes from Dick. We're talking about the Hidden Figures, the movie The Hidden Figures, which some of you might have watched, or the book The Hidden Figures, and Katherine Johnson. And he said they really weren't hidden. They were out there, but nobody really noticed what they're doing. And they were absolutely brilliant. Katherine Johnson was a mathematician. And she went to a traditional black school. And she got the Presidential Medal of Freedom eventually. And she was John Glenn's go-to person. When the computers spit out numbers for Glenn's flight in 1962, and they weren't sure about the numbers, Glenn said, get the girl to check the numbers, and then everything would be a-okay. And she checked the numbers, and everything was fine, everything except the reentry, because they weren't sure that the heat shield was properly attached to the Mercury spacecraft. And had that thing not been attached well, John Glenn would have disintegrated. He would have been burned alive. John Glenn asked engineers to get the girl, Katherine Johnson, to run the same numbers through the same equations that had been programmed into a computer by hand, but on her desktop mechanical calculating machine. She did it all by hand with a calculator. If she says they're good, then I'm ready to go. Katherine Johnson said they were good. John Glenn went. Katherine Johnson provided the calculations that helped sync Project Apollo's lunar lander with the Moon Orbiter command and service module when eventually man went to the moon. She retired in 1986. She was at Langley Air Force Base for 33 years. Mary Jackson, also indispensable to the space program, along with Dorothy Vaughan, women of color who were kind of hidden, who were instrumental in landing man on the moon. The goals were achieved by the Mercury astronauts. There were only 6 flights, not 7 flights. Place the manned spacecraft in orbital flight around the Earth, done. Investigate man's performance capabilities and his ability to function in the environment of space, done. Recover the man and the spacecraft safely, done 5 times. There was a problem with Gus Grissom on the suborbital flight in 1961. The pop hatched open and Grissom nearly drowned, but they did recover him. And so most of the goals between 1961 and 63 were hit. That's Richard Gordon, who ended up being the general manager of the New Orleans Saints. He went from spacewalk to running a football team and not running it very well. Gemini was the next program. It had 4 goals. Test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration flights up to 2 weeks in space, understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in an orbit around the Earth and the Moon, which would be pivotal for the Apollo program, to perfect re-entry and landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts. And there is the Apollo 7 and the Apollo 6. Rather, the Gemini 7 and the Gemini 6 hooking up in space, rendezvousing, saying hello to one another. The Gemini program consisted of 19 launches, 2 initial uncrewed test missions, 7 target vehicles, 10 crewed missions, each carried 2 astronauts into Earth orbit. It was designed as a bridge between the Mercury program and the Apollo programs between 1962 and 1963. Kennedy, before he was assassinated in 1963, couldn't understand why Gordon Cooper in May of 1963 was the last astronaut to go up. Where's the rest of them? We got to get to the moon. But there were steps that the scientists wanted to take. Kennedy, who was no scientist, just wanted to get to the moon. And fortunately, he was persuaded to listen to the scientists. Because a lot of things Kennedy did, he did on his own. without much good advice. The Soviets are still in this thing. There's another spacecraft that they had, the Lunar 2. The first human-made object crashed into the moon back in August 1959, but there would be other lunar missions around the moon. Flybys, first photographs of the far side of the moon. So they are moving ahead in what they're trying to do, land on the moon. The Pioneer spacecraft was another spacecraft that was unmanned. That was heading to the moon, and that was pretty much a failure. The whole thing, except for one mission, failed. Pioneer 0, 1, 2, first lunar attempts, all failures, all identical spacecrafts. They failed to meet any objectives, followed by a Pioneer 3 and 4. 3 was a failure, but 4 was successful in getting to the moon. And my friend Dick Hull, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, worked for NASA, said people underestimate all of these missions, whether it be the Pioneer or the Ranger. They were really important to get to the moon, even the ones that failed, because they learned from failures. The Ranger 7, the Ranger craft, was supposed to crash into the moon, but send pictures like this back of the moon, possible landing sites. The program was a series of unmanned space programs in the 1960s, and it was just one object here, get pictures of the moon, which it did. The spacecraft was destroyed when it crashed into the moon. There was the failure of the first 6 flights, but eventually they got what they wanted out of Ranger 7. The Surveyor program, this is a little more successful. It lands an object on the moon, and they're able to see what, at least through the instruments on this object, what the moon was all about. There were 7 unmanned launches between May 1966, January 1968. 5 of them were successful. Surveyor 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7, they soft landed on the lunar surface. Now, that's a friend of mine from Iceland, Ole Orgesson and his father, and we were speaking together on 3 years ago now, on a celebrity ship. We were in the Caribbean, and he was talking all about space and the space race. And he had some pretty good inside information on the space race, because it was in Iceland where the Apollo astronauts trained. And he has a space museum connected to Iceland, or in northern Iceland, connected to those astronauts who trained in Iceland, because that was the only spot in the world that NASA thought that was very similar to whatever was on Earth and on the moon. So they could go there, they could practice in similar conditions, lava, volcanoes, maybe some ice in the way. And in 2015, Orly basically had a party for the surviving astronauts 50 years later. There it is. Neil Armstrong's family was there as well. The Exploration Museum, and that is adjacent to Orly's other business, 2015. In 2015, he leads an expedition of Apollo astronauts Walter Cunningham, Rusty Schweickart, and Harrison Schmitt, along with the family of Neil Armstrong, to where they were 50 years earlier, except where they were 50 years earlier wasn't there anymore. There was a new lava field of Hullerand, created by Fisher Exposures in 2014 and 2015, and there's a picture of 2 more astronauts over there, Rusty Schweickart up top with Walter Cunningham, and they are going back to where they trained for the Apollo missions, and underneath them is the bus that took them up there that Orly led the bus. Orly had similar expeditions with Apollo astronauts Bill Anders and Charlie Duke to areas near Askja, Kjadur, situated in the remote part of the central highlands of Iceland, where the astronauts trained 65 to 67 before the lunar missions. These guys also had a good time. Neil Armstrong went up there and he decided he was going to go fishing. Didn't need to work on whatever he was doing. He decided fishing was a much better option for him. So these guys actually vacationed while they were up there and threw in some other stuff. These 3 guys were killed on the launch pad in January of 1967. Gus Grissom, that is Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And my friend Dick Hull said it didn't have to be that way. Dick Hole told me with the space missions, whether it's Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo, and he was through all three missions, that a lot of shortcuts were taken to get man to the moon by 1969. That a lot of safety procedures were overlooked, and this is one of them that happened in January of 1927. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first low Earth orbital test of the Apollo Command and Service Module with a crew, and that was to launch on February 21st, 1967. There's a dress rehearsal on January 27th. There's a cabin fire. It kills all three astronauts almost immediately. Dick told me that he heard the video or the tape, and he said, no human wants to hear the tape of these guys' last 60 seconds on Earth. They were just burnt. They were burnt, completely burnt. Grissom, White, and Chaffee. The module, the command module, was totally destroyed. What happened? Well, combination of pouring pure oxygen into the spacecraft, seal the spacecraft door and the capsule's interior, fill it with pure oxygen, and there was a spark. And that's all it took. The whole thing blew up into a giant inferno. It took 90 seconds to open the hatch. They couldn't get the astronauts out. The heat was tremendous in there. The air pressure was tremendous. The spacecraft would rupture, and all three men died of asphyxiation in less than a minute. And there's one of the pictures of where they were sitting. You could see the carnage there. Manned flights were suspended for about 21 months. The cause of the accident was investigated, although Dick said there wasn't much to investigate. They just threw pure oxygen in. They had a loose wire. It was a spark. That was it. It was gone. There would be unmanned tests of the Saturn V rocket and the Apollo lunar module after that, but it would not get, the Americans would not get back into space man business until October 1968. There's another picture of the charred Apollo 1 spacecraft. The fire threw everything into a loop, and that 1969 ended the decade, although 1970 ended the decade. Deadline that Kennedy put on looked very, very unrealistic at that point. The command module needed significant redesigns, and it got it. Michael Collins, who went up in Apollo 11, said there was a silver lining, even though he lost 3 of his colleagues. Without Apollo 1 and the lessons learned from it, in all probability, such a fire would have taken place later in the flight. Not only would the crew, but the entire spacecraft would have been lost. NASA, with no machinery to examine, could only guess at the causes and how to prevent still another occurrence. Yes, Apollo 1 did cause 3 deaths, but I believe it did save more than 3 later. And this is the crew for Apollo 8. That's Wally Schirra and Walter Cunningham and Don Isley. And this was not a happy flight. Schirra lost his friend Grissom, who joined the astronaut corps with him in 1959 and didn't really trust the Apollo spacecraft. There were arguments over whether to launch at all, conflicts over a television broadcast. Schirra didn't want to do it. He had a cold, took contact for the cold, drank Tang as well. There were complaints about the food, unhappiness with the spacesuits. It took 30 minutes to go to the men's room in their case. Schirra was 45 years old at the time, a former Mercury and Gemini astronaut and a Navy test pilot, and he was the one who was the most miserable. There he is right in the middle of this whole thing. But he would eventually go up, and Apollo 7 would fulfill the Apollo 1's mission of testing the Apollo Command Module and Service Module in low Earth orbit. 1968, this is December of 68, NASA is just pushing out the flights in a hurry. There's a schedule every 2-3 months. This is from Apollo 8, which circled the moon. It was supposed to be what Apollo 9 did, check out the lunar module, check out the service module, the command module, but Grumman didn't have the lunar module ready in time for this flight. So they went around the moon and they took a picture. They, being Bill Anders, took a picture of Earthrise. First time we ever saw that. We choose to go to the moon, JFK, 1961, May 25th. That's the Apollo 8 crew, they go around the moon. Apollo 8's mission profile was changed, became more ambitious. Command module only, flew around the moon. Anders takes a picture of the whole Earth. There it is. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, they circled the moon. Anders Borman and Lovell read passages from Genesis. The Earth is good. Don't mess with it. The lunar module debuts, that would be the Apollo 9 flight in March of 1969, the third crewed mission, first flight of the command and service module with the lunar module. James McDivitt, David Scott, Rusty Schweickart spent 10 days in low Earth orbit, testing several aspects critical to the landing on the moon, including the lunar module's engines, backpack life support systems, navigational systems, and docking maneuvers. Apollo 10, Stafford, Young, and Cernan, dress rehearsal. The lunar module goes within 8 nautical miles of the surface of the moon. They wanted to see if that could take place. It does. They fire up the engines. It goes back to the command module, and that brings it up to Apollo 11, July 16th, 1969. And there is Dick Hull, the aforementioned Dick Hull. And Dick Hull plays a role in this one. He's down in Australia, and he's at the tracking station, and his group is supposed to pull the satellite image from the moon to the Earth and then send it out so 600 million people could see Neil Armstrong pop out of the spacecraft. But there is a problem. 30 seconds or so before the rest of the world is supposed to see what's going on, this is what Dick sees in his monitor, and it's one of those, what are we going to do now? We can't show this. Well, oh, hey, there's a mirror. I'll just put the mirror underneath this, prop it up, nobody will know the difference. The Apollo, the guy who is in charge of the Australian tracking station says to Dick Hull, no, you do that, you're going to be fired immediately. And Dick Hull says to him, then you're going to be the laughing stock of the world. And Dick Hull, the time is ticking down. It's about 15, 14, 13 seconds. Remembers at the last second, hey, we're using a new technology here. I wonder if they flipped the switch, because that would explain it. If they didn't flip the switch, we could get the right side up picture. But if they did flip the switch, there's nothing we could do. He flips the switch. That's what he gets to see. Well, this is a color still, but he gets to see an image that's right side up. And he could have gotten to see that image back in 1981 when MTV started. Billions of dollars going to the moon. I want my MTV. Oh, you remember Alice Cramden? Here was a cartoon in one of the papers after Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon. And they look, it's Alice Cramden. She was here first. Ralph Cramden did send her to the moon. But you got to be a certain age to understand that joke. On November 14th is the Apollo 12 mission. There is the crew, Conrad Gordon and Bean. They're up there and they go visit the Surveyor 3, which was up there from a while before. And they take a look at what happened to it and whether it rusted out or not. It didn't. The Apollo program would continue through 1972. 6 missions successful. Apollo 13 never made it to the moon because of an onboard explosion, but it did win some Academy Awards. Ron Howard's movie with Tom Hanks. Space exploration. People always wanted to go in space. Buck Rogers with Larry Crabb, not Buster Crabbe, Larry Crabb, Buck Rogers. No Bucks Rogers. In March 1970, less than a year after the first lunar landing, Richard Nixon signed a directive making the space program just another program competing for funds. The television ratings dropped for Apollo 12. That's all they needed to see. The final 3 missions were scrapped. The program ends with Apollo 17 in 1972. You can play golf on the moon, at least Alan Shepard did in February 1971. He snuck a golf club up there, 2 golf balls, and hit away. The makeshift 6-iron on Apollo 14, and the balls just went and went and went 1/6 gravitation up there. He's first and the only person ever to play golf somewhere else other than the Earth. The last lunar landing, December 11th, 1972. The Apollo 11 spacecraft was on tour. Here it is at the Smithsonian, where it was home for years and years. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the space landing, it took a tour of the United States. Oh yeah, the Soviets did get eventually to the moon, September 20th, 1970, Lunar 16. It brought back 3.5 ounces of rock. The Lunar 24 was the last robotic probe of the moon by the Soviet Union. It brought back some lunar samples. Missions to the moon have been conducted by the Soviet Union, the United States, European Space Agency, Japan, India, the People's Republic of China, and Israel. And the moon has been visited by 5 spacecraft not dedicated to studying it. 4 spacecraft have flown past it to gain gravitational assistance and a radio telescope. That guy in the middle with me is Jim Kennedy. He was the NASA administrator down in Cape Canaveral, and he was talking one day about how it's going to be a public-private partnership sending people into space, people like Elon Musk, who puts out the Tesla. The Trump administration had a goal of returning man to the moon in 2024 with the pandemic. Highly doubtful right now. Well, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours. Anybody have anything to say? All yours right now. Any comments, any questions? Anybody have anything? Can you hear me? Sally? Elizabeth, there you go.
Oh, I've been listening. No, I found it very interesting. Brought back a lot of memories. I lived through all of that, Sputnik and all that stuff. It was good. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Were you afraid of Sputnik?
No. Well, I was annoyed that they got up there first, I guess.
Patriotism.
Yeah.
Patriotism.
But I wasn't, it didn't frighten me. It didn't frighten me particularly. Yeah.
I love the story Bill Cleary told me about the hockey team going to Moscow and they're eating dinner and in the middle of the plate is a little Sputnik. I love that story. I got that story in 1995. And he said, "You ever hear about our trip?" I said, "No." He said, "I'm going to tell you about our trip." I said, "Go ahead." And he did. It's a great story. It is really a great story. I didn't know when I was a kid, I watched Ed Sullivan and the Dancing Bears. I didn't realize that that was all part of this initiation between Khrushchev and Eisenhower back then.
But it brought back memories of the 1980 Dream Team or Miracle, you know, the hockey team beating. That's all I could, reminded me of that. But it was, what, 20 years earlier?
Yeah, well, the American team beat the Finns to win the championship. They beat the Soviets to get the right to play the Finns to win the championship, play for the championship. So that's been lost. Anybody else? Okay, if there's nobody else, I'll see you in 2 weeks. I got my shot, so we're closer for me to be there. And let's see, in 2 weeks, it's the 23rd. So let's see what we are going to talk about. We are going to talk about, we're going to talk about Lucy. Lucille Ball was the most powerful woman in Hollywood and how she got there. The most unlikely story. So that'll be in 2 weeks. That'll be on April 23rd. So anyway, thank you so much. It's a gorgeous day. So thank you for spending time with me. Not as nice as yesterday, but still a really nice day. And I hope everybody is well. And we will see you in 2 weeks then. Have a good one.
Yep,
Take care,
thank
everybody.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.